biannual review of the Boston Employment Commission and Boston Residence Job Policy. The lead sponsors of this is my colleague, Council President Kim Janey, who's just joining us, as well as Council Lydia Edwards. The matter was referred to the committee back on February the 26th of 2020, and there was a hearing on this docket this past spring on April 30th, 2020. I think it's worth taking pause again to note at this spring's hearing, that was actually the first hearing without our former and late City Councilor Chuck Turner, who was a fierce advocate, particularly in my time here in the council. I know I worked very closely with Councilor Turner and Councilor Ross at the time, along with several folks that are on this video as well. And I'd be remiss if I don't recognize the great work of former City Councilor and the late Bruce Bowling, as well as former Mayor Ray Flynn, and the partnership that they created on this particular issue. So want to make sure that we're giving credit where credit is due for the great work that started on this very important policy initiative years ago, years before I ever joined the council. And even while on the council, there was tremendous leadership around it. And now obviously it continues with today's lead sponsor as well. So the body, obviously, in the city is grateful for this work on this initiative, and many other activists and councilors who pushed this work forward can rest assured that we continue to do the best we can to adhere to this and to make sure we continue to push for equity and inclusion on all fronts, particularly as it pertains to the Boston Resident Job Policy. So before I go further, I have to read some procedural information into the record. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 executive order modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law and relieving public bodies of certain requirements, including the requirement that the public bodies conduct its meetings in a public place that is open and physically accessible to the public, the City Council will be conducting this hearing via Zoom. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to the public health accommodations and ensuring public access to its deliberations through adequate and alternative means. The public may watch this via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV. It will also be rebroadcast at a later date on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, or FiOS 964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee. Email us at ccc.go@boston.gov, and that will also be made part of the record and available to all members of the council. We will also take verbal public testimony at the end of this hearing. We do have a few people already signed up. If you have not emailed Christine O'Donnell yet to request the Zoom link to have your name added for the public testimony list, we encourage you to do so now by emailing Christine with a C .O'Donnell@boston.gov. The Boston Residency Job Policy was implemented back in 1983 and sets employment standards and compliance requirements for applicable city-funded construction projects, where a percentage of the workers must be Boston residents, people of color, and women construction workers. Over the years, there have been many amendments to this ordinance, most recently in 2017, which changed the employment requirements to a minimum of 51% of work hours, trade by trade, being performed by Boston residents, 40% people of color, and 12% women. Non-compliance of the Boston Residency Job Policy can result in fines, sanctions, and penalties. In addition to creating an employment standards, the ordinance created the Boston Employment Commission, BEC, and the Boston Residency Job Policy Office, BRJP. The Boston Employment Commission was created for the purpose of ensuring that findings may be determined with respect to the compliance of the Boston Residency Job Policy in a manner that is comprehensive and consistent and fair for all parties involved. The BEC has final decision-making power regarding application penalties for non-compliance. The Boston Residency Job Policy Office, which is the office which sits within the Office of Economic Development, is responsible for planning, implementation, and overall coordination of compliance monitoring of all covered projects, including but not limited to major development projects. Some covered projects are monitored by the BPDA Compliance Office as well. The ordinance requires the City Council to hold biannual hearings in April and October. So before I turn it over to the lead sponsor, City Council President Kim Janey, for her opening remarks, then to my colleagues in order of their arrival, I wanted to just take the brief moment to introduce today's panel. With us today from the administration is John Barros, the Mayor's Chief of Office of Economic Development, Selena Barrios Milner, Director of Equity and Inclusion, Mayor's Office of Economic Development, Christopher Brown, Manager of the Boston Residency Job Policy, and Travis Watson, Chair, Boston Employment Commission. And I know that we also have a second panel that I'll introduce at the appropriate time. And I would have to assume that just given what we're dealing with our COVID numbers and the impact that it's having on our small local businesses, as well as our economic development cycle in general, that we may have some time constraints from the chief as well as the director. And if that is the case, then we'll make sure that once we get through our colleagues, get that testimony and allow for our colleagues to ask whatever questions is necessary. And then at the appropriate time, allow those individuals to go to their other commitments, but ask that someone from the administration be left to participate for the remainder of the hearing. So with that, my colleague, City Council President Kim Janey, good afternoon and welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. While she's not able to be here today, I want to start by lifting up my sister in service, Councilor Edwards. I want to thank her for her partnership on this hearing order. We've been working jointly on these biannual reviews since we both joined the City Council 2 years ago, and I'm grateful for her leadership. Certainly, as you did, Mr. Chair, have to give credit where credit is due and lift up the amazing, incredible work by former City Councilors for District 7, Bruce Bowling and Chuck Turner, for their amazing leadership and advocacy on this issue. And I'm really grateful and honored and humbled to be able to carry on that tradition for District 7, as did my predecessor, Teeter Jackson. So I want to thank him as well. I'm very proud to continue in this work and to continue to partner with so many advocates. So I want to thank the many advocates who work on this issue diligently, certainly folks from the Boston Jobs Coalition. There's the monitoring committee that I convene in District 7, and we look at rock spray projects in Nubian Square in particular. So many labor organizations, certainly the administration. Want to thank you for being here and your work throughout the BEC. For me, this has always been, continues to be an issue that is deeply rooted in economic and racial justice. The wealth gap in Boston between white and Black households is enormous, as everyone knows. And Black and brown communities, in large part, have been left out of the city's economic boom. COVID has obviously made things worse. And so as this pandemic persists, I'm still very much concerned, as I know many folks who are tuning in and who have been working on this issue. I'm very concerned about how COVID has exacerbated the existing inequities, how, the pause in construction has impacted numbers here. We know that for low income, low wage, hourly workers in communities of color, that they have been hit hardest. And this is true during COVID, but also they were the ones who are most likely to be left out pre-COVID. And so as construction jobs are coming back online, it's still very much important that we prioritize hitting all of the goals. I appreciate the efforts that are underway in terms of training, and there's a lot of work that is happening even outside of the administration. So again, I want to thank the many community partners who are in this space, who are doing workforce development, who are doing the job fairs, who are doing their own kind of jobs banks to make sure that there is more equity. We are still far from the goals. There is a deep, deep, deep level of frustration that despite not hitting the goals, that sanctions are still not being applied. We watch these numbers closely, particularly for District 7. I watch them as a District 7 counselor. I look at the numbers for big construction jobs or projects in my district. We look at whether or not Boston residents, and certainly I want to prioritize residents of District 7, but Boston residents, people of color, and women. And while there have been some improvements in some areas on some sites, and I know overall people will say, we're doing a much better job at hitting these numbers. But when you look job by job, trade by trade, it tells a different story. And so, I just think it's important that we continue to be very intentional about what we're doing on the front end to develop the pipeline, what we're doing for folks who already have some skills but are not getting work, how we can make sure that they are getting some work. We know we have, construction companies that have their own crew that they'd like to keep working. And I can appreciate when you've got a good team, you want that team to work, but how are we feeding and getting a more diverse pipeline in there? And how, finally, again, on the accountability, we've got to get to a place where people see that this is real. And it can only be real if there are some teeth. And there is just a lot of frustration that we are not doing all that can be done to ensure that we're hitting these numbers. This is more important than ever before, with so many people out of work, with so many people trying to reconnect. I have a lot of questions on what is happening with the city's job bank and what, how we are matching folks up for these jobs. And I'm hopeful that this review will move us further down the road to a place where we are truly hitting the goals on every single trade, not just on the overall numbers, and that we're especially being mindful that as we see people pushed out of the city, this is another phenomenon that has happened. We see sometimes you're able to hit the people of color numbers, but there's been this gap with Boston residents. So we've got to make sure that Boston residents in this city, communities of color in this city, and women who historically have been left out are able to get these jobs. And we've got to hold these sites accountable. I also want to thank the monitors. So there are monitors who work and report every single day. And I've had the pleasure of working with monitors on the city side as well as the BPDA side. And I want to thank folks for their hard work as well. And I want to thank my colleagues for tuning in. And I hope that we can move forward and get beyond the frustration that folks feel. Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to the panel and everyone who is tuning in and working on this important issue.
Very good. Thank you, Madam President. And we've been joined by our colleagues in order of their arrival: City Council Liz Braden, City Councilor Ed Flynn, City Councilor Andrea Campbell, City Councilor Kenzie Barr, City Councilor Juliette Mejia, and City Councilor Matt O'Malley. And I know that we have time constraints for the administration, so I'm going to go right to the administration panel and allow my colleagues, when they get recognized, they can give a brief statement and then get right into their questions. So Chief, great to see you. Appreciate the work that you've been doing throughout the course of the pandemic. And obviously, as this now starts to tick back up again, your schedule obviously has to be crazy as you're trying to guide us through the economic portion of this. The fallout obviously has been devastating to a lot of businesses in Boston, particularly our small local businesses. So the work you're doing, the work your team is doing, you guys are doing yeoman's work. So appreciate your attention to detail on that. And I know that you're joined by Selena Barrios Milner, Christopher Brown, and Travis Watson. Good to see all of you. And again, appreciate all the work that you guys are doing. So with that, I'll turn it over. The floor is yours, Chief, and in order of how you want to introduce folks or the presentation. I know that our colleagues are in receipt of, I think it's a 16 or 18 page slideshow, but I'll defer to you, Chief. Good to see you, and make sure you unmute yourself.
Councilor, great to see you, and good afternoon, Vice Chair Flaherty. Thanks for your leadership and partnership, President Cheney, President Jay, for your leadership and legacy as you talk about District 7, the leadership that's come out of there. Councilors Flynn, Breeden, I see Councilor Campbell, Bach, Mejia, O'Malley, Asabi George. Thank you for all of your partnership as we try to address the inequities in our economy and make sure that people can participate. For the record, my name is John Barrows. I am Chief of Economic Development for the City of Boston. With me today is Travis Watson, Chair of the Boston Employment Council. Selena Barrios-Milner, Director of Equity and Inclusion for the Office of Economic Development, and Chris Brown, Boston Residents Jobs Policy Manager. So I want to first thank the council for inviting us to speak about the Boston Employment Commission, the Boston Residents Job Policy, known as BRJP, both of which are priorities under the Walz administration. Now more than ever, given the devastating impact of COVID's pandemic, we need to support programs like BRJP to ensure access to good paying jobs for local residents, for people of color, and for women. Therefore, I want to thank you for your ongoing partnership and leadership on the topic. I also want to thank Travis Watson for his leadership and a steadfast commitment to achieving the goals set forth by the BRJP ordinance and all of the members of the BEC. They do this not because they have to or because they're getting paid, but because they genuinely believe in a transformational nature of the work, its mission. That also applies to the dozen of community activists who regularly participate in the BRJP process, who do this work, who monitor, who bring back information, and who push on behalf of the residents, of the women and people of color of Boston. Thank you for your work. Prior to turning it over to Selena to discuss the latest numbers, I wanted to make sure that Travis Watson had an opportunity to give an opening statement. And I'd like to address a few items that were robustly discussed at our last hearing. As you know, a critical component to implementing the updated BRJP ordinance is to be able to push forth the new goals of the ordinance. And I just want to frame this a little bit. We changed the ordinance goals as indicated by Vice Chair Flaherty in 2017 because we were hitting those goals. And these new goals are helping us to stretch, diversify the ecosystem of those who are working on construction jobs and be more inclusive. And so we are in the process of pushing towards consistently hitting those new goals. Now, in some of those goals, though, we haven't performed as well. We have to do better in making sure that more women are participating in the trades, and we have to do better in making sure that more residents are participating on our jobs. And it's critical as we come up with new goals and we want to stretch that we make sure that we have new procedures that help us to stretch to those new goals. So one component that is critical in implementing new procedures is the use of SALESFORCE, a new data platform. So I'm pleased to report that the historical data that has been migrated and the new projects that are being inputted in real time through SALESFORCE will allow us to share in a transparent way how each project is doing. It's critical. But as with any technology overhaul, however, there are new issues that continue to arise. So therefore, the city has contracted a Boston-based MWBE contractor to support the BRJP team in its use of SALESFORCE. This will allow us to identify issues and create solutions as we continue to use the new system. Selena will be talking more about that. Additionally, we are hiring a full-time SALESFORCE administrator, which speaks to our long-term commitment to getting this process right. It's taking longer than we wanted to, but it is the backbone of us implementing the 2017 ordinance as it's been approved by the council. And Selena will talk about that effort. Equally important as the technology is our ability to monitor construction projects as we continue to be optimistic about the future of construction in Boston. Having a sufficient number of city employees dedicated to this work is even more critical today. Therefore, the mayor has committed to funding 2 additional construction monitors to increase our capacity to do this work. Now that we have made critical investments in technology and workforce, we now must act swiftly to create a transparent process for fines and other sanctions. In order to do this, we will work with Chairman Watson to create 2 new subcommittees within the next 60 days, led by Chair Watson, that includes other stakeholders. The subcommittees will be charged with creating a regulatory framework for the BEC to determine an appropriate and universal corrective action plan for projects in noncompliance. This does not currently exist and is necessary to ensure a fair and consistent sanctioning process moving forward. Now, I'll remind everybody that that is all hinging on us having transparent data on the SALESFORCE platform. So as you hear from Director Selena, you will hear where we are on that platform. It's super important that we have the data available to everyone. We will also be establishing a second subcommittee to create a record of non-compliance for companies that do not adhere to BRJP. Once created, the city will be able to use these records as a determining factor when awarding future city funded construction contracts. Once again, hinging on transparent data on the SALESFORCE platform, which is super critical. Furthermore, we are in active discussions with DCAM, or the Division of Capital Asset Management and Maintenance at the state level, to make a non-compliance of BJ directory available so they can consider it for their certification process. We're super excited to have that conversation with DCAM and their willingness to work with us on this. This would enormously impact the BRJP and allow us so that if contractors performing on city work does not have the right history, we can make sure that we impact their ability to secure work on state projects as well. I am now going to turn this over to Travis Watson, the chair of the Boston Employment Commission. Vice Chair Flaherty, as you stated, I do have a hard stop for 1 o'clock because I co-chair the Health Inequities Task Force for the city, and we do have our standing meeting at 1, but looking forward to a robust conversation before that.
Thank you, Chief, obviously, and thank you for addressing some of the housekeeping issues. We were going to start with the questions from the chair around the SALESFORCE platform, as well as the construction monitoring positions, as well as the subcommittee. So those are going to be the questions right out of the gate. So I appreciate your attention to detail to sort of tackling sort of the leftover items for the last hearing. I'd also want to recognize 2 of my colleagues that had just joined, City Councilor Anissa Asabi-George and City Councilor Ricardo Arroyo. And with that, we'll turn it over to Travis Watson, I guess, for his statement. Welcome, Travis.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Just make sure my mic's here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I have a bit to say, so I'm going to jump right in. First, the BEC and the BRJP are moving in the right direction. I will let others speak on this more, but some quick highlights include: we now have a full 7-member commission that is a majority women of color. As Chief Barrows added, the mayor's recently added capacity to the BRJP team, and the Office of Economic Development hired an MBE firm to help with SALESFORCE. Lastly, contractors like Mario Susi & Son Excavation are helping lead the way with BRJP compliance. Ray Susi, if you're listening, thank you for your efforts. They're truly appreciated. I'm going to use the remainder of my time talking about racial equity. If those of you who don't know, besides chairing the BEC, I'm the Director of Racial Equity and Community Engagement at the Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation. There I help ensure that the construction projects that we finance maximize workers of color and MBEs. So I bring a racial equity lens with me as chair of the BEC. And let's not forget, and I'm quoting the ordinance establishing the Boston Residents Jobs Policy here, quote, whereas Black, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American residents of the city of Boston, as well as female residents, have historically been systemically excluded from the construction trades and unions in the history of Boston. Today, Boston is a majority minority city, but 0 construction unions in Boston have a person of color in a senior leadership position. 0 construction unions in Boston will disclose how many people of color they have as members. And I believe with the information that is available to the public, and from what I see, that roughly 95% of Greater Boston's MBEs are non-union, and that Boston's construction union membership is only 2 to 3% Black. 2 to 3% Black. If I'm wrong, please, unions, show me the data and prove otherwise. I love what unions represent, but my love for racial equity is far greater. In at least one of these other hearings, I've heard a city councilor or two mention, quote, "This is a union city." And while that may be true, I hope the following testimony will help those listening understand what that means to so many people of color and what we need to do to make the mantra of "this is a union city" something everyone can embrace regardless of race. Please bear with me as I recap what most Black people's experiences with construction unions in Boston have looked like. But before doing so, I will quote a former leader of the movement to abolish the slave trade, William Wilberforce. "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know." We'll start in the 1950s. According to Joe Corbett, who joined the Carpenters Union, the BA sent two of us out one morning for a job, an Englishman and myself. The contractor put the Englishman on the job and told me in no uncertain terms that, quote, "It's a disgrace for an N-word to come and apply for a job in the shop. An N-word's rightful place is in the railroads and as a porter." 1968, the Boston version of the Model Cities program, the Boston Urban Development BURP program, was formed. Quote, "All the Black guys were laid off and all the French Canadians were kept," remembers Leo Fletcher, a carpenter on the job. "Somebody from out of the city, even out of the country, getting paid to do work that I could do in my community." 1968-69, the United Community Construction Workers, UCCW, was formed to combat discrimination faced in BURP. And in 69, according to former United Community Construction Workers activist Omar Cannon, quote, "They'd always say you had to be in the union to get a job, and you had to get a job to get in the union." 1970s, Chuck Turner works as chairman of the Boston Black United Front and tries to help secure 2,000 minority construction workers union jobs via the Department of Labor's $680,000 grant for the Boston Hometown Plan. 74, through the Department of Labor's Manpower Training Act, Chuck Turner, Leo Fletcher, and others won funding for a Third World's Jobs Clearinghouse to act as a secondary source of labor for contractors seeking to fill quotas on publicly supported jobs. 76, 2,000 to 3,000 white union construction workers marched on Boston City Hall, demanding the city council defund the clearinghouse. 1980, former construction worker Earl Quick recalls that, quote, "I got my book in 1980. I went down to the hall and I sat there for months. White guys would come in and go right into the business agent's office, and they'd get out, then they'd get work, and me and the rest of the other Black guys would just sit there. I never did work in Boston." 1980, a federal court in Boston found that the oral section of the exam given by the ironworkers was so subjective and so open to abuse that it had almost no bearing on the ability to do the job. And for some reason, the court also found whites almost always passed the test, but Blacks almost always failed. In 83, Earl Quick states that when he did work, the union men on the job dropped bolts on him and called him the N-word and sunshine. 1986, according to Mark Ehrlich, a well-respected former white union carpenter, quote, "The affirmative action campaigns have changed the industry, though not dramatically. Many white union leaders and rank-and-file workers continue to express resentment at the presence, minimal as it is, of people of color in the trades." I want to be very clear here. Over a number of decades, while Boston's construction unions were building some of the nation's most impressive buildings, many of their white members were simultaneously building one of the nation's most powerful and deeply entrenched systems of racism. So where does that leave us today? Recently, I've been making good trouble in calling attention to Boston Union Construction's history of racism and their current lack of racial equity within their ranks. A few weeks back, I was featured in the WGBH article, "Boston's Diversity Hiring Mandate for Construction Projects is All Bark and No Bite." I was shocked at the response that I received from Mike Monahan, the International Vice President of IBEW. He responded with a rambling email that, amongst many things, named my hometown, where I live with my wife and 2 small children 4 times. And then he signed the email, quote, "Good night. What time does the sun set and rise in Falmouth? Make sure you lock your doors." Let that sink in. The International vice president of IBEW, wrote, quote, "Good night. What time does the sun rise and set in Falmouth? Make sure you lock the doors." To me, in response to an article where I'm quoted expressing my frustration with union contractor, not even in his trade, for not hiring residents, people of color, and women consistent with their contractual obligation to the BRJP. In other words, my family was threatened for doing my job, my volunteer job. So I asked myself, if he's comfortable putting that in writing from his IBEW email address, what is he saying to people off the record, to those less senior to him? Are there other Mikes out there in union construction? If so, how many? Look, I have mixed feelings on cancel culture. However, I am 100% behind canceling out the Mike Monagans of the world. It's 2020. That macho, I'm going to try to bully you, isn't effective anymore. It's not intimidating. Honestly, it's sad. There's about like 0.5 to 1% of me that feels bad for the Mike Monagans. I understand that the information that I'm throwing at people like him might be hard to hear. Many white men live life reaping the benefits of white privilege and have, for whatever reason, failed to recognize how prevalent systemic racism is in our society. It must be further challenging if you are someone who genuinely believes that Boston's union construction industry doesn't have a history of racism. Construction is complicated and nuanced, right? Because the thing is, some union members, such as Brian Doherty, Charles Cofield, Craig Ransom, Mary Vogel, Barry Cady, Andrew D'Angelo, just to name a few, both understand union construction's past history, accept that history, and are trying their hardest to move forward to a path of racial equity. So we need to support the work of the Bryans, the Charles, Craigs, Marys, Barrys, and Andrews out there. At the same time, we need to be pushing those that are living in the past out of relevance. This work, it's not all rosy. There's some bad players out there. Let's weed them out. The Carpenters Union is probably the most racially diverse Boston-based construction union. And with that said, they have a lot of work to do to get with the times. Look, Charles Cofield and Craig Ransom, who I just mentioned, are two Black union carpenters. Combined, they must have well over 50 years of dues-paying union membership. They're both well-respected within union construction in the cities and communities that they work. They should both be in senior leadership positions, period. It's shameful that they aren't. Taking a step back, here's the dilemma. I feel like this is starting to feel like the who's going to sign Jackie Robinson and be the first baseball team to integrate baseball of union construction. Which local is going to be the first? I feel like once it's done and a person of color is put into a senior leadership position, others will follow suit. The biggest stain on Boston sports history is being the last team to sign a Black player. Heck, Jackie Bradley Jr. is about to hit free agency and will thus leave the current Red Sox team without a Black American player. One of the greatest outfielders of my generation, Torrey Hunter, had a full no-trade clause to Boston in his contract due to the amount of racist language directed at him and other Black players while he played for the Minnesota Twins. Much like Earl Quick, who I mentioned earlier, neither man ever worked in Boston for one main reason: racism. I hope the similarities end there, and that it's not a sign that Boston will also be the last city in the country with a Black person in a senior leadership position within union construction. We can do better. Let's step up, come together, and be leaders here. But to be honest, I'm about 50-50 that in the next 10 years, a person of color will be promoted to a senior leadership position within Boston's union construction. 50-50. I'm starting to believe more and more with labor and civil rights leader Tyree Scott when he stated, quote, "You can't leave those who created the problem in charge of the solution." Boston Union Construction's volunteer racial diversity and equity initiatives aren't cutting it. They're moving too slowly. And again, I want to be very clear. I love what unions represent, but my love for racial equity is far greater. And this one shocks a lot of people, but I believe in it deeply. Critiquing construction unions does not make you anti-union. In fact, I believe strongly that not only is it my right as a free Black man, but my obligation as chairman of the Boston Employment Commission to raise awareness and do everything in my limited power to create access and opportunity for every resident, person of color, and woman. But let's get real and stop talking about construction unions like there's some holy institution that's leading the way in diversity initiative. They have a ton of potential with some strong white allies and positions to help create change. But they still have leaders in place like Mike Monahan. And thanks to Bob Holder's recent article in the Globe titled Far-right militias heed Trump's call for poll watchers, and law enforcement is worried. At least one union member that was, quote, denied membership in his local 3% branch because he was deemed too militant. And when asked should Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden win the election, he said, quote, I see tyranny getting ready to steer our constitutional freedoms. He vowed to stand his ground. Some might be asking, why am I picking on unions? It's fair. I'm calling them out for two main reasons. Construction unions perform the vast majority of downtown projects and perform an enormous amount of construction hours in the city on a yearly basis. Construction unions' jobs aren't just jobs. They aren't just good jobs, but they are great jobs. But only when both Black and brown people have membership and senior leadership positions at rates consistent with the diversity of the city. And it's these great jobs that are needed to help address the racial wealth chasm that exists in Boston. As some of you know, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's The Color of Wealth in Boston reports that the average white family in Boston has a net worth of $247,500, while the average Black family has a net worth of $8. And while construction is by no means the only path to financial stability, it does provide a unique opportunity given its low bar of entry and the large amount of construction active in the city. Now the solutions. To move forward towards a place of racial equity within Boston's construction unions, this is what needs to be done immediately. For starters, I recommend the following. Establish a working committee consisting of members representing union construction, the BRJP, community-based organizations, and residents to explore and implement a framework for racial equity. Transparency. We need to understand what we're working with in order to understand if what we're doing is moving the needle fast enough. We need construction union member, race, and gender transparency. Let's take a deeper look at why this is so important. Even some well-intentioned union construction diversity and equity work is well off the mark. For example, a union advocate recently emailed me to let me know that, quote, union member data isn't collected by any unions, building trades or otherwise. What is collected is a mass apprenticeship data program data with a breakdown by program. This data reflects a new workforce, the place where we can make gains, end quote. This strategy for diversifying union labor appears to be more smoke and mirrors than meaningful systemic change. Let me explain. Say the mass apprenticeship program has 50 new Black members in 2021. For those 50 people and their families, that apprenticeship means a stable job that provides financial security, training, safety, and the potential for shared prosperity. It's commendable work. However, without knowing the baseline for the total number of Black union members, we don't know how much that 50 Black apprentices increase the overall number of Black union members. If, for example, 50 new Black members increase the total percentage of Black union members from 5 to 10%, that shows some results. But if that 50 is only increasing overall Black membership from, say, 2% to 2.2%, well, then that program needs some tweaks for more significant impact. And again, I want to be clear here, 50 new Black and brown apprentices are fantastic, especially if you look at it in the micro. Those 50 individuals are potentially in a position for a career that pays fair wages, offers top-of-the-line training, and benefits. The micro also helps deflect criticism of racial discrimination and makes for great headlines. I'm glad that people are working in this space, but I'm focused on the macro. I'm concerned with how those 50 Black and brown apprentices fit into the more extensive system and how their apprenticeships affect systemic racism in the union construction industry. I'm not interested in nor here for incremental change. We need to know how previous classes of apprentices are faring. In other words, of the X amount of Black and brown apprentices from, say, 2015, how many are still in the union? How many worked enough hours to move to a journey person? How do the total number of hours worked by those Black and brown workers compare to their white peers from the same year? This is the type of data needed to determine whether current efforts are having the impact needed to create measurable change in racial equity. We need to know how many members each local has and how many of them are Black and brown. Otherwise, it's impossible to tell whether the number of new Black and brown apprentices is making the type of change needed. And if it's not the impact that we need for real change, systemic change, then let's figure out a way to get there. And from a compliance standpoint, the question then becomes, who's at fault here? Is it the contractor's fault for not hiring the right people? Or is it the union's fault for not having the membership base diverse enough to meet the goals of the BRJP? Until we can honestly answer that question, then we are spinning our wheels and at great risk for punishing those for offenses outside of their control. Regarding sanctions, long way down the road, I want to see us move to a place where fines or sanctions are automatic. It should be incumbent upon the contractor in violation to pay or dispute with the BRJP office. If there's not a remedy there, then they should come to the BEC. We shouldn't need to hunt them down. Let them come to us. I'll close with the same words in which I began. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you for your testimony, Travis, and then Selena, and then Chris Brown. You guys have anything to add to that?
So if we could get the presentation up, that would be helpful.
Sure. Kerry, if you're listening in, or Christine, can someone have the presentation put on? Bear with us 1 second, Selena. Kerry, do you have the ability, Kerry, to put that on? And or Christine O'Donnell.
I'm working on it right now. Sorry about the delay.
Not a problem, Bell. Hang tight, everybody. Council President Janey, as the lead sponsor, and because we will only have Chief Barrows for about another, say, 10, 12 minutes, is there anything that you would like to ask of the chief and or my colleagues if they have a pressing question for the chief before we allow him to move on to his next appointment?
Sure, thank you. I think, though, the presentation is ready. I would like to get to a question around sanctions. We heard Chair Watson bring that up. I brought that up. It's something that comes up every hearing. So I don't know if you want to briefly say anything about that before Selena gets in with the presentation. The frustration, Chief, is that every 6 months we're at this hearing. Every 6 months we have cases and examples of folks who are out of compliance, at least around BRJP goals for diversity, but the way the language is worded, if they submit whatever paperwork in, so something has to give. So I guess a question is, I heard you say, Chair Watson, you wish it was automatic. Well, I think we all do. How do we get to that place? Because the frustration is that people are not complying, yet they still get all of these jobs from the city, or they get to continue to work on private companies with no consequence for not adhering to the goals. Can you just speak to the sanctions piece before we move on?
Madam President, thank you for the question. So as you say, it is frustrating, and I know the chair is going to work with the subcommittee to move it to a more streamlined process, and that is the goal. Today, what we know is that many cities have lost their jobs goals policies because they've been challenged and lost in court. One of the challenges for how we do this work is, as you know, we can't sanction on performance of being able to meet the goals. We sanction on people's defined best efforts to work with us in meeting the goals. And so there are 7 categories that we find by. At present date, when we looked at this, we did a quick analysis before the completion of the SALESFORCE application, is we find, in fact, if we were to go to find right now, we would be finding a number of companies that are meeting goals but not meeting compliance. And so we just need a little bit more time to both be able to come up with the data analysis and regulations that allow for us to defend this in court, while at the same time not being counterproductive to people being able to meet the goals but not meet the 7 compliance areas that we have, and figure out how we reconcile the two.
And when you say we need a little time, please define that. For me, you know, I'm in my 3rd year now on the council, and I feel like we've been working on the SALESFORCE piece since I first got here. You know, it's frustrating. So if it's frustrating for me in my 3 years as a counselor, imagine how frustrating it is to the advocates who have been at this for decades. And then imagine how frustrating it is for the people who can't eat because they can't get the job because it keeps going to these other folks. So I don't know if we need to revisit the language so that it has more teeth. I don't know if it is these subcommittees that have to get off the ground. I don't know what needs to happen. but something's got to change so that there's a different kind of threshold where sanctions can be imposed upon folks who are not doing their due diligence. So I'm not sure that we've got, I think we need to really, I'd like to spend some time getting deeper into this issue with some folks. I don't know if we want to call a working session on this, so that when we come to our next biannual review, we're in a much better place. But my frustration is I feel like we are having the same conversation every 6 months.
Yeah.
So, and I don't want to delay. I know we've got, before you want, Mr. Chair, before you wanted to get into questioning, you wanted to let the panelists go. So I just wanted to put that to you, Chief, before you have to leave. But this is, we've got to do something different.
Yeah, Madam President, your frustration is shared. It's been expressed publicly by Chair Watson, members of the BEC, staff, and myself, and members of the city. And so Selena's going to give a presentation on where we are, the things we've done, the additional capacity that we've brought to this, and give you a sense of next steps on what we need to do to make sure that we have clarity in sanctioning.
Very good. Thank you, Chief. Your presence is excused, and if my colleagues have any specific questions, they can call or email you, and we'll go from there. So, Selena, great to see you, and I appreciate your patience while we worked out the technical difficulties, but you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm Selena Barrios-Milner, Director of Equity and Inclusion in the Office of Economic Development. Thank you so much, Councilor Flaherty, Madam President Janey, and all the counselors that are so committed to this work and that are here today. I also really want to thank Chairman Watson. He just recently started his second two-year term at the BEC and as chair. And as chair, he shoulders a lot of the leadership of the commission. And he is by far, I don't even know, like when I know that he has this other full-time job that he's amazing at. He's an amazing parent, amazing and responsive to community advocates, to contractors who are looking for guidance. I just can't underscore enough how much we appreciate you and how much I believe us moving the needle forward is really, will be in close partnership with you and your vision for this work. So thank you for your service. So I want to start off, we can go to the next slide just to give you a little roadmap of where we're going, and the one after that. So we're going to, the goal of my presentation is to give you a sense of the BRJP project data and how we're doing, update you on the SALESFORCE platform, and also talk about recent work around pipeline development. I also want to just start by saying that in this time, I stand in solidarity more than ever with Boston's Black and Brown residents that have suffered so greatly due to both COVID and racial discrimination. I've had about half my family has thankfully survived the virus, and I have two family members, one of them in construction, that have lost their employment due to the current economy. So I personally am feeling the impact of this pandemic, and I'm reminded daily of how differently me and my family experience either prosperity or crisis, depending on where we're situated. So I'll take you through how we're doing today, but more importantly, what we can do to do better in partnership with all of you. So to get started on the project data, I want to pass it over to Chris Brown, our BRJP manager, to take us through how we're doing.
Thanks, Selena. Good afternoon, everyone. Christopher Brown, manager for the BRJP office. So I'm just going to give you a quick breakdown of going back 6 months from the last hearing that we had. So from April until up until September, we've had 127 total projects, active projects. 92 of those projects have been public projects. Those are City of Boston projects. The Public Facilities Department has had 32, Parks and Recreation Department 8, Public Works Department 25, Department of Neighborhood Development 27. So the percentages, so as we know, we have a new BRJP ordinance, and as of now, about 90% of the projects that we have are under the new ordinance. In the beginning, some of the larger projects, the DIPs, were grandfathered in under the old ordinance, but as we go on, as we move forward to now, about 90% of the projects are under the new ordinance. And I would say of the city projects, about 95% of them are under the new ordinance now. So the new ordinance, the percentages, so I just want to say off the top, COVID has done a number on construction in terms of the work hours. So last year, around this time, we had about 4 million work hours. And as you can see now, we have about 2 million. So it's cut the work hours in half. So work hours for new ordinance projects, 1,707,000, 26% resident, 40% people of color, 77% women, and all projects. So new ordinance and the projects that are under the old ordinance, we've had about 2 million projects. 2 million work hours. And so 26% resident, 39% people of color, and 7% women. All right, that's from April until September. And the work hours are about half of what we had last year, same period of time. Can we move to the next slide, please? And so this gives you a breakdown of where the projects are located at, 127 active projects. The downtown projects, 34 projects are usually like the skyscrapers, the projects that are in the Seaport area, the Winthrop Center project. And the Roxbury projects are more so housing projects, and also Dorchester projects are housing projects, but they also include public works projects as well. So you have a breakdown by the different city departments here. The neighborhood development department is always the department with the most hours. That's the department that has the housing projects in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, primarily 304,000 hours, 30% resident, 68% people of color, and 5% female. Then we have a parks department project. They deal with like parks, renovation of parks, playgrounds. Usually a small department, about 8 projects a year, 16,000 hours, 3,500 resident hours, that's 22% resident, 26% people of color, and 4% women. Then we have public facilities department. That department deals with city buildings, city properties, renovations, and so forth and so on. 92,000 hours, 35% Boston resident, 42% people of color, and 9% women. Then we have public works, that sidewalks, streets, 16,000 hours, 27% resident, 30% people of color, and 3% women. Okay. Thank you. Moving on to Selena.
Thank you so much, Chris. We could go to the next slide. So as Chief Barrows shared earlier in his remarks, we've now migrated all of our historical data into the Salesforce platform. And as we start new projects, we are putting them straight into Salesforce. The big challenge we're having, which is really the crux of the functionality of the platform for compliance purposes, is pulling the right reports, the reports that you all are used to if you've attended a BEC meeting, that have both the statistics of the current projects as well as a look back on how specific contractors or trades have done in the past. Those are really critical. And we're finding out not just critical to us, but critical to the general contractors and developers. And so not being able to consistently pull reports that have accurate information is actually a pain point for developers that rely on our reports to make sure that they're meeting their end of the bargain. And so this really is a problem, because until we can say, you know, this number is the same here and on your end, and regardless of the view, then that data are not reliable. Those data are not reliable for monitoring, and definitely not for sanctioning. So we feel like we're close. The city lost some key resources and are now investing to make sure that we have the technology assistance that we need. We feel we're close in terms of fixing some of those problems on the back end. Will be, you know, this was all shared before, so I won't get into it. But we have had an incredible experience with the contractor we brought on board initially to help us train and onboard GCs and subs, especially the smaller subs that don't have as robust of a back office, but they have also been able to really identify the technical problems, so we can really do a narrow scope for the additional assistance we need, and that's Onyx Spectrum, Boston-based MWBE. Next slide. We have, so we'll be investing in full-time Salesforce admin, as well as 2 additional construction monitors. Next slide. This is the part I really am passionate about. I'm passionate about all of it, but developing the pipeline so that I never have to hear there isn't a worker available for a particular trade is something that I know Chairman Watson has raised, and something I'm also really passionate about. So thanks to really, and I know this is something Councillor Flynn, a recommendation he made, and Councillor Edwards, while we have folks sidelined, let's make sure to not only offer more CSL prep courses, so people that maybe are working can become own their own company with their construction supervisor license. So let's not just offer more, but let's make sure we cover the cost of those materials, which, as you see, is $350 for the set of books that you need to be able to not just learn, but to take the exam. So we've taken your recommendations to heart and have been able to offer 3 cycles of this class since the pandemic began. They've been sold out each time, and now we're just trying to allocate resources to do the next one. And then next slide, please. This really came out of our last city council hearing, and Councillor Edwards really, and Councillor Flynn as well, really talked about how are we developing the youth pipeline. You know, we're doing some work with giving existing construction workers additional skills, but we developed as part of the Mayor's Summer Jobs Program, a Tools of the Trade Construction 101. And this was really designed so that young people that couldn't work in person throughout the summer could spend some of their time working outdoors through the Summer Jobs Program. And the rest of the time, we reached out to young people and said, who's interested in learning more about a career in construction? And we're able to, really thanks to Nicole Richer of the Compliance Mentor Group, design an 8-week program to expose young people to careers in construction and to let them know how to get started. And so this was an 8-week class. There were 87 BPS high school students that were broken down into 5 cohorts. There were expert facilitators that made sure that it was a quality experience. There was never more than 20 people in the small group conversations. And really exciting were industry experts who shared their firsthand experience in architecture, design, surveying, management, business, real estate, all the different parts of construction. I think people have a really narrow view of what is entailed in the construction industry, but there are so many different types of access points for everyone, including working on our team, right, at the city. So there's a lot of different entry points, and we made sure to highlight that for young people. We also had some great partnerships from some of the unions, private sector partners who really, they even gave, they would go on the site and sort of bring the young people with them. And this was a really incredible program that we hope to continue to offer during school breaks and in the summer as well, because it generated a lot of interest and connections for these young people, a lot of them that were feeling really down and disconnected due to the amount of time that they haven't been able to pursue their regular jobs or social activities. Next slide. The other project I'm really excited to share with you is, as you know, there's a major renovation going on of City Hall Plaza, and it's a total dollar value of that one project is $79 million, and it'll take, it's expected to be completed next year at the very end of next year. And so we thought, what better opportunity to really get people into good construction jobs and into the, exposed to the different ways that they can work in their own city, than really focusing on our own front yard, right? Boston City Hall Plaza. And so we're going to be offering a City Hall Plaza renovation job fair the first week of December. We haven't finalized the date. It's going to be virtual, especially as case numbers are going up. We want to make sure and stay safe. And we want to, we're partnering with Shawmut, which is a general contractor, as well as the building trades, the union training centers, and building pathways. Because right now the trades that are mobilized on the job are all mostly union trades. And so we want to make sure that this becomes an entry point for people outside of the regular application process or outside of the regular workflow for getting into a union. And so this will be an opportunity for people that are licensed or skilled or want to become licensed or skilled to connect directly and get some of their hours on our own project. So this is going to be the first week of December. And then we're going to offer another one in the spring for the trades that will be mobilizing at that time, which are going to be a lot of non-union trades. So it'll be a different set of partners. This also coincides with, there's about a third of the unions do their enrollment between January and February. So we want to make sure that this is an opportunity for people to, or not their enrollment, but their application process for people to find out and get connected in time, as well as Building Pathways does a new class starting in January. So we want to just, make it very concrete for people, not just throw up a bunch of resources on a website, but really through this one job opportunity, hopefully expose them to a broader range of options for their careers. Next slide, please. A couple more updates related to the BEC. Next slide. I know we mentioned we have Chairman Watson mentioned we have a new slate of commissioners. The folks you see here, some of them are in this picture. You also see some monitors and some other folks testifying at the BEC. I couldn't, right now it's hard to get a group picture, but I did my best. But we've added Jao Cole Burton from Maven Construction, a Black woman-owned construction company. We've also added Carlos Espinoza Toro from JPNDC, who has a really strong focus on developing MBEs to be competitive for construction and other contracts. Dr. Aisha Francis from BFIT, who is really helping us think more broadly about our pipeline development work. And then the folks with the asterisks are folks that have served and renewed their terms. I unfortunately, in my rush, did not put an asterisk next to Commissioner Broomstein, but she's a returning member, as well as Charlie Cofield and Stephanie Everett, who took a leave, but then was reappointed as well. So we have a dynamic slate of commissioners. We've had quorum at every meeting for consistently, which has been really great to keep these conversations going and to keep folks accountable in between meetings. And we also did a really thorough training of the new commissioners, which is a new practice that we're establishing, is really making sure everyone fully understands the ordinance, what their legal, what are all the tools that the ordinance gives us, and how do you as commissioners play a role in this enforcement picture. Next slide. Just some staffing updates. If you haven't had a chance to meet her, we have an incredible new Jobs Bank coordinator, Janine McLaren. She actually came from the Veterans Department, where she was focused on connecting veterans to employment opportunities. So this is really her passion and her expertise, and she's bringing a lot of good, fresh thinking to this role. And she'll be helping a lot with these outreach events that I've mentioned. And then we're in the process of hiring 2 new construction monitors. So these are different than the investment of 2 additional ones. These were filling existing vacancies from folks that retired or moved on. So we should have 2 new construction monitors onboarded before the end of the year. And that's it for just my updates here to help answer any questions, and really looking for your partnership in both continuing to find workers and connecting them to opportunities, and also continuing to refine our processes to make sure that we can be as effective as possible. And any other partnership you all want to do. I know you have great ideas all the time. So thank you all so much.
Okay. Thank you, Selena, and obviously thank you to Travis and to Chris Brown as well for their testimony. And Selena, to your point, I've said this from my earliest involvement with the Boston residency job policy, is that part of my frustration, I think, would go a long way in helping this, is that, getting, our unions, particularly our trades, to share or to take a census of their membership to identify how many city kids they have working for them, how many people of color, how many women, until we get that. And the frustration is that we don't have that data. So we're not able to sort of put pressure on them to hit those benchmarks so that we're able to supply that labor force to a specific job. And I do know one of the issues just from dealing with the unions is that the person will start out as a city kid and then they move. They get married or in search of better schools for their kids, or a parking space, or a driveway, or a front and back yard that we don't often get living in the city. So their membership is constantly churning, if you will. So, but I think it's really important for us to be able to have that data to work with them so that we are creating on-ramps and pipelines to them. And I'll also leave it that the partnership that's been created with Boston Year 13, with a cohort of 25, particularly in the STEM field, working with Wentworth and also the industries that in the partners that you had mentioned, they're playing a huge role in preparing the next generation to come into those, not just the sort of the labor side of the house, but the management side of the house, construction managers, et cetera. So there may be a good partnership with your organization in Boston Year 13. So that said, I'll turn it over to the lead sponsor for some questions. I know our colleagues have been extremely patient in waiting to ask their questions. And I know that we do have some folks that have signed up. I know Ms. Priscilla Flint Banks, Black Economic Justice Institute, has signed up for public testimony, as has Mr. Norman Stembridge, co-chair of the Roxbury Strategic Master Plan Oversight Committee. So I want to obviously give them the courtesy and mention that they've been waiting patiently as well. So with that, with respect to this panel, if the lead sponsor has any questions, you have the floor, Council President, and then we'll go right into the order of arrival. That's Councilor Braden, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Bach, Councilor Mejia, Councilor O'Malley, Councilor Anissa Asabi George, and Councilor Ricardo Arroyo. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly want to be mindful that my colleagues also have questions. So if you have a timer, feel free. I think for me, I really want to dig a little deeper into the SALESFORCE issue, understand what the challenges are of why we're still talking about that my 3rd year in. The sanctions piece, still huge. What do we need to revisit looking at the language of the ordinance? Is there something that we need to do to update the ordinance? Should we be monitoring or looking at different things? But I think the sanctions piece, I agree with Chair Watson. I would like to understand the membership of our labor unions better. I think that is an important data information that we need. I'm not sure how we get there other than to continue to build and to have partnerships with organizations that are willing to kind of work with you, like the Carpenters Union, and to try to continue to build around diversity. But I think we do need those numbers. The jobs bank is another place that I like to focus. And why don't we start there? You mentioned a new hire, which is great. Would love the opportunity to sit and meet with her. I think for me, in my little experience here on the council, it wasn't just an issue of whether or not we have an individual in that role. I would really like to hear what your thinking is for how we revamp the whole jobs bank, because my sense of it being here is that it was just a bunch of names that didn't have anything real behind it, that there were names that it could have been in that jobs bank for the last 15 years of people who could live in Atlanta for all we know by now. So I'd like to understand how we're keeping that up to date. Maybe that's connected to the SALESFORCE, I'm not sure, but I would like to hear how we're revamping this whole jobs bank beyond the hiring of a position. That's one question.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, feel free to jump in if I miss anything, because I know you work a lot more closely on this. But it is, you know, Janine has been taking in new applications and checking against. We're not really carrying over data that's too old. We're trying to vet what we have just to make sure we know, are you still looking for a job? What is your skill set? You know, doing a refresh conversation. But there is sort of a challenge that it would be helpful to think about in terms of just the basic design, because the way it works is we have workers available, we have projects that aren't meeting the goals, let's match them up. It doesn't actually always work that way because, you know, the worker may not have the necessary license or they, you know, like, and so is this really the best way to get these workers into a pathway to a career in construction? And I think
what information do we collect? Are we collecting that information in the jobs bank to see which skill sets, which licenses, which certificates, which whatever folks have, so that when these opportunities are presenting themselves, we have a much better data pool to draw from? Are we collecting that data now, the certificates?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can jump in. So there's an application on the website. So if a person is looking for work in the construction industry, they go into the website and it has all these different questions. What type of licenses do you have? You know, your address, your name, so forth and so on. So we've been getting about 10 a month, about 10 workers or individuals looking for work, filling out their application on the website, and it comes directly to us on it directly populates on a spreadsheet that we have, that the jobs bank coordinator has. And most of the individuals that we get that fill out their application, they're non-union individuals, 99% of them. And I would say 95% of them are laborers with really limited skills. So we're looking to pair. So you have a question about, you know, the new, you know, what the new jobs bank person is going to be doing. We're going to try to set up a bi-weekly matchmaking, so to speak, a virtual meeting with the workers that she has in her database, the ones that are filling out this online application. And we're going to try to identify underperforming companies, contractors, and have them show up at that bi-weekly virtual interview or whatever you want to call it to see whether we can make a match. A lot of times it's up to the contractor
Mr. Brown, I'm just mindful of time. Okay. So are we also then, so the jobs bank then is a pool, and it sounds like it's a very entry level pool. Yes. And that historically it's been kind of the lower skilled kind of laborer position. How are we taking that pool of people who are saying, I want to work, and helping them to then develop more skills where the real money is? So I see this not just of a matchmaking between construction companies that are just going to have them sweeping up the floor and making $12 an hour. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a real pathway and real opportunity for folks to be able to take care of themselves and their families. So you know, what you shared in the presentation, Director Barrios-Milner, was lots of opportunities for, I thought I saw, to develop their, you know, to get a certificate or a license, that you were also doing that. Is there then that kind of matchmaking happening with the jobs bank to not just the jobs, but to the skills that would get them the better job?
Yeah, that's a big part of our commitment. And that's what Janine is trying to stand up is both making sure to connect them to our offerings, but obviously our offerings are limited and not available every week, and also understanding what other resources there are to connect them out to those resources in the community or with other partners. So to make that link a little bit stronger, and not just saying like, go look at this, but really connect people out to what their next step needs to be.
So my other two areas are just the sanctions and the SALESFORCE. If we could just quickly shift, because I know other folks want to jump in here. I would really like to get at what needs to happen to get sanctions. So I know, and so the sanctions are not, people are not going to get sanctions because they fail to hire. They're going to get a sanction because they failed to submit a report. People fail to submit reports all the time and are still not getting sanctions. So somebody help me understand, why aren't these folks getting sanctions?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all interconnected. Our data are not, we don't have the same, we don't have the ability to track the compliance measures with our legacy reporting system. And so it would be, it took a lot of manual analysis to say, we know payroll, we know who's submitting their payroll on time, and we know who's verifying their residents, the 90% or above. That we can pull from our legacy system.
But I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
We know, everyone on here knows and can probably name someone who's a bad player. So even if there's a capacity issue to kind of figure out how we track this with everyone in the long haul, why aren't we being a little more laser-like focused on at least trying to go after, here's been the big Moby Dick who keeps getting away with doing all this crazy stuff. Why aren't we going after that person, even if we don't have the capacity to kind of do it more broadly? Because part of the thing is people just think this is a show. People just think this is a game and a show, because no matter what happens, people will hire who they want to hire, and it's their own boys, their homeboys that have been with them forever. No one else is getting the opportunity, and they know they can keep doing it because there's no consequence. So at this point, there needs to be sanctions, because too many folks are not adhering not only to the diversity, and I know the way the ordinance is written, you can't get a sanction for the lack of diversity. I know that. Maybe lots of other people don't. Maybe that's part of the frustration, but the lack of reports. I have been to several monitoring committee meetings where X contractor has failed to submit reports for X number of weeks, and still nothing happens.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. And what we find is whenever we move to say, well, this person's clearly out of compliance, then you're always going to find someone that's less in compliance. So it becomes this, like, if we have to kind of draw a line, everyone that's here and below is going to get sanctioned. If not, we look like we're playing favorites or picking out projects in certain parts of the city. And that's what we keep coming across, is that when we get to a point that we're like, okay, this is clearly black and white wrong, then there's always the one, well, they can point to, well, this other person's doing worse, or this other sub is doing worse. And I think that's the complexity too. Each of these projects have dozens of subs, right? And so you can find like one bad sub, but maybe when you roll it up, the project is overall not doing that poorly. And so it's the data piece is really complex, and we invested in this system to take out the complexity, to take out the subjectivity.
So help me understand that piece. What do we need? What do we need in terms of SALESFORCE, and what is that timeline, so that come April, when we have this hearing again, we're not still talking about, we got to get SALESFORCE up and running and off the ground and hire this person and all of that. Like, when are we going to get to the place where we feel like we've got SALESFORCE in place, we've got reliable data, and now we're ready to hit whatever that baseline is? We're going to name it, and we're going to go after folks who are not doing what they need to do. When are we going to get there? Do you have a sense of that?
I have a sense. And I hope I'm not taking people too into the weeds. SALESFORCE is traditionally a database you would use in a campaign or as a salesman, saleswoman. It's something that tracks, identifying information, and then you say, and it was designed for folks doing sales, hence the name. Over the years, people have really leveraged this platform.
Oh, is it just me?
Selena, yeah, no, Selena froze.
Master signed.
Is monitoring. Yep.
I'm sorry. You froze up a little
Selena,
bit.
you froze for a brief second there.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
We're trying to take something that was built in a certain way and make it do something else. And we think that this is the best way to track all this nitty gritty of our ordinance, which no other city has something like this that we can just copy and paste their system, and have run into issues with that, into making it do what it wasn't designed to do. We also had some transitions in the city resources assigned to this, both from BPDA and neighborhood development. And that's why we need our own person in-house that can help us with this system, because we are relying on resources that have transitioned and that weren't in our department to begin with. And so then we're left with something that we don't know.
Yeah, so now we've got a position has been created, a person's going to be hired. At what point? The end of the year, we're going to be where we need to have everything in place so that we can start 2021 being able to really monitor and hold folks accountable. Like, I'm trying to get a timeline. Chief Barrows mentioned in a little while we'll be able to. I'm trying to understand, define what that little while is, so that, obviously I don't want us to still be having conversations come April. Like, I want to understand how it's working come April. And now we know we've got this, we've got that. But I still feel like we are working out some of the bugs or trying to. So when, is there a timeline that you could say by the end of the year you think will be there?
I hope to be able to have a developer or administrator in place by the end of the year that can help us fix these bugs. It is really close to being there. We can see a lot of great information. We're just trying to pull the reports that everyone's used to seeing, and that part has been challenging. But as a dashboard, it's there. Like, you go there, you see great interactive data. When you try to turn that into a report is where we are hitting a wall. So I believe we're close, but I'd hate to assign a specific date without myself not understanding the technical, like the amount of hours that it will take to fix the technical issues.
Mr. Chair, I have more questions. I want to thank this panel, but in deference to my colleagues, I'll wait for round two if there is a round two. And also want to make sure that we're hearing from the public as well. So thank you again to this panel. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam President. In order of arrival, Councilor Liz Braden. Councilor, you with us still?
I'm still here. Thank you. Thank you. I just had I'm learning so much about this conversation this morning, and I really value all the great information that I've gotten. I'm excited to hear about the youth program, the summer program. And I was wondering, you had 78 high school students signed up in 5 cohorts. How many of those students were young women, and what was the breakdown?
I can pull that up if you want to go to your next question. I don't have it right in front of me, but I can definitely pull that up for you.
And also in terms of the youth pipeline, I'm wondering in terms of what are our partnerships with the Madison Parks Vocational Technical High School. Like, it feels like that should be a source of, that should be a really robust pipeline in which to develop and bring young people into the trades in Boston.
Yeah, I don't know, Chris, if you want to add anything in terms of connections to Madison Park.
So right now, there's a limited connection. There's really no connection. We had one meeting like a year ago with Kevin McCaskill, and so we're still trying to work on having develop a relationship with them.
Okay, that seems like really big missed opportunity when you see some of our vocational technical high schools in the suburbs and further out in the state. They are generating a pipeline of young people ready to go into the trades, and it's something we need to pay more attention to, I feel, in Boston.
And Councillor Braden, I put up the participant demographics, and unfortunately what I have is a racial breakdown. I don't have the gender breakdown. I do believe it was pretty balanced. And some of the, I don't know, I sent an older version of the presentation, but we did have some participant testimonials, and a few of them were women saying it was great hearing from women in construction because it's not a common, it's not something you see a lot. So, but I will get that to you.
Yeah, I really feel that we can't let that one slide off either, because it's a great opportunity for young women to get into the trades, and the balance is slightly off at the moment, or we're not coming close to the targets in that area either. So I know there's lots of folks with questions, so I will just yield my time and let my next colleague ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. Chair recognizes City Councillor Ed Flynn. And make sure you mute yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Flaherty, and I want to say thank you to my colleagues, Councillor Janey and Councillor Edwards, as well, for their work on this issue, and to the mayor's team, John Barrows and Mr. Brown and Selena and Travis as well. What I wanted to focus on is relating to what Councillor Janey discussed. And I know the BPDA was also trying to head in this direction as well. When there is an issue when there is a vote at the BPDA, are we asking these companies what they're doing in terms of outreach to women in construction, communities of color in construction? Is that an opportunity for us to have almost like a checklist or a question to be asked during the debate or during the process? Are you actively reaching out in hiring women? Are you actually reaching out and hiring communities of color in construction? And that's one question. And the second question I had is, if companies are not in compliance, whether it's submitting a report or if they're not hiring women or communities of color, what sanctions does the City of Boston have if they're bidding on a City of Boston construction project? I would assume that company would not get the project. Is that accurate to say?
Can you say that one more time? If they're bidding on a project and what is the case?
If they're bidding on a project, they're not in compliance at all. We wouldn't be giving that company the contract. Is that correct?
So this is sort of the new lever we have that I'm really excited about, but I think the common understanding is that the Mass General laws on procurement would supersede a local program like Boston Resident Jobs Policy. However, we have gotten direct legal guidance that not being in compliance with BRJP we're allowed to take that into account when we say we have to take the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, which I know we've talked about this a lot in these hearings, and we have been given the green light to say that is a fair definition of not responsible. So that's why we really want to establish this list that we can give to our city buyers and say, this month, this is who's out of compliance. Please do not go to the next highest bidder if you get the lowest bid. And also what Chief Barrows, and I just want to put a finer point on it, was talking about in terms of DCAM is that in order to have valid DCAM certification, you have to be meeting all your responsibilities with the various contracts that you're working on. And that's one of their criteria. And, you know, they have insurance, bonding, but being in good standing is one of their criteria. And they have given us, we still have to formalize this, but they have given us the invitation to send whatever list we establish of those folks that are not in compliance, and that will be taken into account for their annual DCAM renewal of their certification, and it will affect their score. And that's something that is worth gold to these contractors. And so we think that that'll give us another lever to really hold people accountable. If you're out of compliance with us, it's going to affect your other jobs in the state as well.
Thank you. I have other questions, but in the interest of time, I will not ask them. But my main point is we have laws on the books, but if the laws aren't being enforced, you know, that's the big issue is what sanctions would there be? And that's what I'm really looking to hear. But again, thank you to Chief Barros and the team from Economic Development, and thank you to Councilor Flaherty as well for his work on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Chair recognizes City Councilor Andrea Campbell.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Travis, for that incredible presentation, specifically laying out the historical context here, which most people don't know, and what drives the fight today, not only for the work around equity, but to also get people to understand why it's so critically important. So just wanted to thank you with respect to that presentation and your leadership. And I, of course, want to continue to thank the makers of this work as well, our President Janey and Councilor Edwards, of course, who couldn't be with us, for continuing to press this issue. And picking up on what Councilor Janey said, I, too, remain frustrated because this has been a conversation since I joined the council 5 years ago, with Congresswoman Presley then pushing and pushing for us to do better, pushing for changes with advocates to expand the legislation, to expand the numbers, et cetera. But we continue to talk about the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability. And this isn't a knock on you, Chris or Selena. I know you guys are working hard, probably overworked, right? Given the range of work within you guys' portfolio. But at some point, it gets really difficult as a district councilor to go back to my district, which is largely Dorchester and Mattapan, largely a district of color, by some metrics, one of the poorest in the city of Boston, being devastated by COVID-19, especially on the economic front. Struggling, of course, to get people in the unions, and not to say the unions are not working with individual councilors to try to change that. Some of them are. But we have this apparatus and this legislation in place. But what good is it if there is no teeth, if there's no accountability or enforcement? And so I think it's still unclear to me, and this is now an hour and a half in, what, you know, Travis just recommended ways in which we need to be more transparent, in ways in which we need to be more accountable in our enforcement. I'm still confused, even as a lawyer, why we can't have automatic enforcement. At some point, I hear the legal argument, well, they can sue us. And well, sometimes you just got to fight the fight and let them sue us. And if folks want to sue us with respect to these issues, well, go right ahead, because I think it says a lot about the private employers, about certain institutions that would sue us as we're trying to do what's best for our constituency and for communities of color to take their rightful places in terms of these jobs, but more importantly, to have the economic means that we all know is so necessary for them as individuals, for them as families, and of course, to close the racial wealth gap, which Travis also mentioned, and which I know Councilor Janey is always talking about. So I am at this point really wanting to know, putting aside SALESFORCE and various things we're trying to do, what can we do like tomorrow with respect to the sanctions piece, with respect to changing any legislation, filing any new legislation in order to be able to enforce this ordinance in such a way that people don't continue to ignore it. Because if we don't get that right, it literally doesn't matter. You know, the ordinance we put out there, who cares? And so that's my first question. And then the second is, on this transparency piece, what levers or what could we be doing to push these institutions to give more of their numbers, to be more transparent with respect to their numbers? What levers could we be pulling? I think in other industries, we're seeing them do maybe a better job with that, gaming commission and the gaming industry. What can we do? Because it continues to also be a question that I think we have to address in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, so to your first question, I want to make it clear, which I don't think I did a good job of this, that there is a lot of monitoring and compliance work going on short of sanctions every single day. And so one of the tools we have with City of Boston projects is we routinely withhold payments for anyone who owes us any reports. And that gets the reports in right away. So there's a lot of corrective actions that we take every single day. One of our monitors had 4 corrective action meetings yesterday. And often after those meetings, you see people get in line. Sometimes it'll be a new sub that it's their first BRJP project. And then they're like, oh, okay, got it. Let me have that additional one-on-one time. And so that happens. That's what our monitors do every single day, right? They meet, they call, they email, they pester, right? And a lot of things do turn around. I think Chairman Watson mentioned one of the contractors who we've seen turn their act around. And the other really strong enforcement piece that we have is the BEC itself, and coming before the BEC. And oftentimes in those conversations, specific recommendations are made and heeded. We've seen, Wayne Griffin, for example, has started running ads in the banner and doing, reached out to all the different outreach sources we've recommended and community partners. And so I don't want to make an excuse for not doing sanctions, because ultimately we need that lever. We need to not award contracts when people are historically out of compliance. And so those are levers that we need, and I think are some of the strongest ones. But I also want to underscore that there is compliance conversations happening every single day that I believe are effective.
Celine, I do hear you. My only concern with the corrective action that is, whether it's through the BEC or some of these meetings, it's, whether it's consistent across the board, right? It could all be relational. And the importance of, when you're pushing for equity, is to have sound policies and procedures so it's not relational. So people can't just pick up a phone and say, I'm working on it, get back to me, which we know happens in the city all the time. So, and then the sanctions piece, while that corrective action may be okay, it still doesn't, of course, like you just said, allow us to have that as a lever. And the question is, what is the barrier to that? Because that's what the advocates and the constituents are pressing us on. And I don't have a solid answer for them, which is frustrating for me too, as to why that can't get done.
Yeah, and I think
they know about the other pieces, right? They're the ones who actually are probably bringing us more data, because they're out there doing the work too. So they know about some of the corrective actions, but for them, that's not enough. And so if people are routinely violating the law, the question is, how do we push the envelope with respect to sanctions?
Right, and I think you sort of in what you're saying in terms of equity and making sure that that every contractor, every subcontractor, every project is being treated the same way. That's why for us the data piece is so vital, to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. And it is, the data piece is crucial, and it's something that we need for our day-to-day work, let alone to move to sanctions or any other of the enforcement actions that we're tasked to do. I also wanted to ask—
That's my last question, which was the barriers to that, the barrier to the data piece.
Barrier to, so
we're talking about that too.
Yes, there are 7 compliance measures that are laid out within the BRJP ordinance. And so the 2 most well-known ones are payrolls and residency verification. That's what we talk about all the time, but there's 5 others. Do you have a way for people to apply for work at your job site? Are you reviewing those applications? Are you attending the meetings we're inviting you to? And all of those other pieces we don't have a data way to pull that. And so someone might be meeting the first 2, but out of compliance on the other 5, and we can't hold them accountable on that. And that's why we're building the system that can track all 7, and that can also track when was the last time there was a site visit to this project, like things that can be, all of that, any of our monitors can tell you, but it's not something we can pull or that we can show to the public, which is really important to us. And so we feel like we need that, that level of analysis and data to be able to treat every project equitably.
Well, I want to be mindful. My colleagues are obviously on here too, and I don't know if there was a ringer that went off of people's time as well, because clearly it's been an hour and 40 minutes. But we'll keep pushing on the sanctions piece and the data piece to have this figured out like tomorrow, because it is just beyond frustrating. And I know our Madam President said this at the beginning, but it's beyond frustrating. We're past the point of frustration with folks who have been working on this for decades and who care so deeply about this issue. And why? Because we all need economic stability, particularly in this moment in time when we are seeing that that is not the case. And so this seems like the low-hanging fruit because we have the legislation, we have the apparatuses there, but that we are not, for some reason, getting over the hurdles to get to the transparency, accountability, and sanctions piece. So I'm here to be a partner in this, to keep pushing, of course. Thank you for the presentation as well. And Travis, thank you very much for your presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Chair recognizes City Councilor Kenzie Bach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the whole OED team for being here, and to Travis. I want to second the thanks for your remarks and also for just your tireless work on this, because I know there's a lot of frustration lots of councilors have expressed and that you've expressed about kind of where we're stuck. And I just appreciate that you keep putting your shoulder to the wheel on this. I guess I will try to also keep my questions brief because I know how many folks are in line. I just want to say, Selena, I'm really heartened to hear about the legal opinion that we can consider non-compliance with BJRP in issuing contracts, and that as soon as we have a kind of, ready, refreshable list that we can share with DCAM, that they will also take that into account, because I really think that's the only way to really change this, is if people think that they won't get new jobs because they're out of compliance. And the flip side is that could be a very effective way. So that's the thing that I've heard today that makes me think that maybe we won't be in the same place in April next year. So that's good to hear. I guess in terms of getting that list, what I'm hearing you say, I actually once jerry-rigged a Salesforce database for a purpose it wasn't designed for. So I have some familiarity with the insanity of what that looks like in the back end. But if I went into a record right now, because it's a CRM database of one of your construction, one of the contractors, would I be able to look at the individual record level at all 7 of those indicators? Or are we not? Are we not even right now keeping track of that at an individual record level?
We wouldn't be able to track the compliance measures at the record level right now.
Okay, so the issue, and that's obviously what you need, and then it will be relatively easy to pull a report. And are you guys working with somebody at Salesforce to change things in the back end, to customize it for us? Or is it just a question of somebody who has some Salesforce experience who's been hired by the city?
Yeah, so Salesforce actually doesn't provide any customer support that you would think of. What they do is so they don't have in-house technicians. Yeah. They provide the licensing and training so that other people can do it. And so that's what we're looking to hire. We did have 2 people within the city that were doing it as a way of, so that we wouldn't have to put something out and spend money on it. So we had internal resources, one from BPDA and one from DND. One was a Salesforce developer, the other was an admin level, and they have both moved on. And so we had sort of, they were supposed to build it, not maintain it, because they have other projects and other departments. And so that's why we want someone in-house that's just working on this for us.
I got it. But you haven't hired that person yet?
No.
Okay. And is that job posted right now?
No, we have to. So that's what because we are developing the scope for that based on what the current state of the system is. We had a scope for building the system, which is what we did in-house and didn't need to hire outside, but now we need an updated scope, which is what our sort of training contractor that came on that we mentioned is helping us develop that scope of what are the links that need to be fixed.
Okay, I see. All right. So, yeah. Well, that seems like then we've still got a little bit of a road because we have to hire that person. They have to get inside of our system, and then they need to set up this new. And then you're also going to need to collect data for a certain period of time before that is a sortable, useful list, right?
Yeah, the data I'm not worried about because our monitors are monitoring, you know, through the access system, which we're able to migrate data into it. So it's not like they're not monitoring it in absence of its system. So then it'll be about transferring, whether it's from a system or from their files into the new system. So that I'm less worried about.
And why are we not able to generate this list from the access system right now?
Because they weren't data input fields in any way, and so they're just not. They don't exist in.
So we would need to jerry-rig either Access or Salesforce. It makes more sense to do it to a modern system.
Yeah, and the city no longer is supporting Access. That's sort of like a legacy system, and so there's no technical resources for that.
And you guys have looked around for if there's something that exists. I mean, I know no other city has a program just like ours, but if there's something different from Salesforce that would be more able to modify more minorly, and Salesforce feels like your best bet still.
I believe so. That was before my time, but I believe there was a thorough look. And also the BPDA is doing the same type of monitoring, and they do have their own IT department. And this was, jointly what was decided was the best solution for the nuance of what we're trying to monitor.
So they use Salesforce as well?
Yeah.
A same database, or are they operating a separate database?
Same, but there's some kind of I don't want to call it a firewall, but there's their view of it and our view of it. But for the contractors, it's the same experience of data entry.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I certainly, I'll ask around in the world of folks I know who work on Salesforce about, whether there's some wizard out there who we should be hiring. But it just sounds, I'm just, yeah, I think this is, it has so much promise to be the critical piece if we can have that list and we can feel confident in that list and generate it. But I also, I'm nervous about the timeline on this. So we'll happily follow up. And then the one other question I have is just, to Councilor Janey's point about that big jobs pool and how it's a lot of folks who kind of would fall into the laborers category. I mean, they're not union laborers right now, but in terms of their skill profile. And my understanding, the more I've dug into this issue, is just that we have a real problem where the folks who get paid the most, right, are the folks with licenses that you have to sit exams for and that you also need a bunch of hours. The reality is, I don't know if it's come up in this hearing really, but part of the reason that is so racially skewed is because a lot of times people start their plumber apprenticeship working for their dad or their uncle. There's a family basis, at least in some of the, especially things like plumbing, electrical, et cetera. And so it's you really, and you're going to need those hours to move up the chain. So it really feels like we need a whole alternative apparatus for getting people into the high paying licensed roles. And a piece of that, Councilor Braden's 100% right about, right? A piece of that is we should be getting people should be coming out of Madison Park having taken their first licensing exam. And I don't feel like we're quite there right now, but I just wonder if you could update us a little bit on where the department's conversation is on that, because I do think it is a piece of the puzzle to plug folks at the kind of laborer level into job opportunities. And right now in a recession, that's an important piece of the puzzle. But I know that the aspiration and the attention on this industry is about the strong wages that can be earned, further up the licensing tree. And I just haven't heard much that suggests that we're sort of on a path to crack that.
Yeah, I think, Chris would have more expertise on this as well as Travis, because I think this is part of where the union conversation comes in, because if you're, and this is where my expertise is limited. But if you're in a union, then your training and everything is done through that union. And so that's why there's sort of, and Chris, just correct me because I always get the terminology wrong, but that's why there is a push, like what we're doing with the City Hall Plaza, to get people onto a job, but through a union, because then like they can rise from labor to take their necessary skill, tests and put in the hours so that they can get licensed. But feel free, I know Chris and Travis have much more expertise on this.
Yeah, so in my opinion, what's missing is training. Right, so access to training, and the biggest training facility or organization right now in the city of Boston are the unions. You have like Youth Build Boston, like Building Pathways. They're not really providing hands-on training. They're just talking about construction, introducing everyone to construction. But it's really the training organization right now is the unions. You have like Benjamin Franklin that offers like HVAC classes, and there are a couple of organizations like that. But it's about getting individuals trained.
Right. And the challenge, as I understand it, and I want to say, I feel strongly that the solution here needs to be diversifying our union workforce, because I think it's important for us to, be a union town, Boston, but that's not just a sort of line. It's more like what unions do is they keep these wages we're talking about good, and they keep these jobs good jobs. And so what we want to do is be getting people of color and people who live in Boston, right, into these good, and women, into these good jobs. And so, so I'm a bit familiar with Building Pathways because I came up through the Housing Authority, and also appreciate, I think reference was made earlier to the carpenters and their diversity as a union. But I think the challenge, as I understand it, Selena, is that you don't really progress, like the laborers union is great. You progress up the food chain in the laborers union, but you don't progress from being a laborer to being a plumber. Like it's a whole separate vertical. And so it sounds like, Travis, is it fair to say that part of what we need is an apprentice and training program really focused on specifically the highly paying licensed trades?
I think that could certainly help. If I take a step back at like the 30,000 foot level, I've been trying to better understand folks' entry points into the unionized trades for a number of years. And I think we need to work with them to help simplify the process. It's not clear right now, for example, some of these HVAC or these mechanical trades that we're talking about, it's not like some of these folks from Dorchester, Roxbury can get on the MBTA to go fill out the application. Some of these applications are accepted in the suburbs. Got to talk about how's the test designed. I talked to some folks in the trades and they're like, I took the aptitude test, but it actually had no bearing on the actual job. I believe the Carpenters Union, as an example, is the only union that has people of color as the actual instructors. So there's a lot of work I think we can do to help make the process more transparent so that any student in BPS who identifies, hey, I might want to do a trade in 5th or 6th grade knows, okay, if I want to be a plumber, I get the application downtown Boston, I take my test at the bowling building, and I'm ready to go. I think that's a piece to it. And I did want to mention just briefly, it's not through the city of Boston, and I'm going to butcher the acronym here, but it's the UAPT, I believe it's the painters and tapers trade. They do have, at least as far as I know, a couple years going, a really good partnership working within Madison Park Development Corporation. Whereas some students who I believe if they identify, I think it's by sophomore year, and I believe it's just the painting trade that they want to get into that trade, that I believe that they can graduate at not as an apprentice. So they might have credits towards a journey person. So I think there's other programs like that are at least being modeled now that we could probably piggyback off of and see if we can replicate with some of the other high paying trades.
Great. Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. Chair recognizes and appreciate your patience. City Councilor Juliet Mejia.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty, and thank you to President Council Janey for her ongoing, what it seems like ongoing, everlasting fight in this space. Really do appreciate how hard you go on this issue. It really goes to show that Boston has such an amazing opportunity, and I think that oftentimes we lack the coordination and sometimes, sadly, the political will to move people out of poverty. And so I'm really happy to be here. And I do have some questions, and thank you to the administration for all your hard work. I'm still stuck on this whole database situation. I just feel like I can create a Google form and get all the data that I need and be able to track it, right? So I just don't understand how difficult it is to really get some numbers in terms of where we stand. And I understand that we're going through a new SALESFORCE, but I just feel like to me, it's like this hurry up and wait. And it's like drip drop traction here. And so I'm curious about the tracking process that we have and whether or not there is an option to see from when a person gets into the database from the time that they get a job. Do you have that capacity? Is that something that you're tracking from the moment? And how long does someone sit in that database without getting any type of communication? So I'm just curious, does that data exist?
Okay, with the Jobs Bank has a list. Jobs Bank coordinator, she collects the list of individuals that are looking for work, and when she sends that work out to a contractor or a monitor, when that person gets hired, then the Jobs Bank coordinator is notified.
But where does that person's name? I'm talking about, like, the way I'm envisioning this is I'd like to see it in some sort of a dashboard. So let's just say, a person, an ID name, maybe we can't put their name out there, but at least some way of us being able to track the progress. And also, I'd like to be able to, this is just some recommendations. You don't necessarily, if you're doing it now, great. And if not, it would be great to have in the future that we know that person A entered the resource bank, got a job, finished that job, and then was able to get another job at another contract. I'd like to see progress, and I'd like to be able to track that so that we have that data to measure it in terms of your long-term outcomes. So I'm just something for you all to consider. And whether you do it or not, if you don't do it, you should be doing it. And if you can't do it, you got to go to Google Forms and figure out how to do it, because this is something that I think is worth us knowing. I'm also curious about whether or not that the tools of the trade program, is it a paid internship? Great. And after they complete that program, where do they go? Do they end up at a job site? Do they end up, what's the cultivation look like after they complete the internship?
Yeah, so the design we had in mind is exactly that, and leveraging the summer jobs program so that folks are getting paid, but partnering with private sector partners. This launch was done virtually, and so it limited, and that's why people were literally taking them through their work site so they could see what it looks like and what it feels like, but it was all done virtually this time. But we hope to add an in-person component and to continue to offer this program when young people are on breaks.
And would that be paid internships continued?
Yeah, we're trying to leverage the city's internship program. So there's a summer jobs program, but they also offer them through the school year. And this is something that people are really passionate about. So yeah, that's our model.
Okay. And then I do have a question about, and I've said this in previous hearings in regards to the lowest bidder. That prevents a lot of folks from competing. Because usually the lowest bidders are the ones that have the most dollars, because they can take a hit financially for bidding on a lower contract. So how are you all dealing with that?
Yeah, so I think that's work that we need to talk about in partnership in terms of policy reform. The DCAM is looking at reforming some of the existing filed sub-bid laws, which we've spoken about here before as well, can be limited.
the database. I'm going back to the database. I'm obsessed with it. And how often is it upkept? Like, to Councilor President Janey's point, in terms of like, there could be somebody there that no longer even lives in Boston. Like, do we do proof of residency? How do we track whether or not someone is actually really from Boston? Is that accountability that's happening?
So not to get too much into the weeds, but so the current database that we have, what happens is a contractor starts work on a project. They have to submit a payroll to us electronically. It goes into the database, and then we're able to produce. Okay, and also it gives you the weekly submission time, and it also gives you the percentages.
And how often do you do that? Because I know, everybody knows how to scam the system, right? So I can put a whole bunch of folks who live in Boston the first week, and then let them go. Is this something that you do on a regular basis? Like, do you keep status of these on a regular, weekly basis? Is that what I'm hearing you say, Chris?
Yeah, on a weekly basis, we have monitors that they have a set of projects, and they look in that database and they check all their projects, all the different areas every week.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good, Chris. I'm happy to hear that that's happening on a regular basis. Yeah. And then I'm also just curious about these sanctions, and I would have to echo the advocacy that my colleagues have been saying, is that you're not going to really change behavior unless you really are serious about corrective behavior. And I think that, we can continue to say, oh, we want to increase, but we need talent. It sometimes is a little bit offensive, because it's what I I'm really excited in terms of like the accountability piece. Is there a dashboard of these folks who are not living up to that standard, that publicly, those folks, we can hold them accountable? Is there a bad actors list of shame?
Yeah, there's no specific list that we have, but we can go into the database and I can run a hit that we have. And if you have a developer that's looking to build a project, they're often, if they're looking at a certain
have a list. The next, I guess we're going to meet again in April, because this happens every quarter, I believe. Can the next time we meet, can we have a list of the bad actors? And then it would be great if there is a way for us to provide them with some, I know the sanction situation, but like some building of their capacity, right? Like, we need to have people who are going to be willing to want to work with the city. So perhaps, maybe we help incentivize them or provide them some technical assistance as to why they should be doing the right thing. And if,
So that list would be extremely powerful, particularly with some of the for both the city, but also for for-profit developers. I found oftentimes that there is a huge disconnect from a project manager on a project that might have requirements or expectations for diversity on a project. Huge disconnect with that individual and the procurement department. Folks I typically have worked with in the procurement departments are looking straight at numbers. They want to hit a budget, and that's what they do. I've seen that happen to an earlier question within even the city of Boston. So I think that on some projects, and this gets to your question, Councilor Mejia, a bit around the file sub-bid project and that process. So a lot of our public facilities projects are not 100% file sub-bid. So my recommendation would be better coordination between the City of Boston's procurement department and this list of either good and bad players. So that the procurement department, if they're looking at Jim Jones painting and all of a sudden he's on the top 10 worst offenders for hiring women, no, they should be, get out of here. You're off the list immediately, in my opinion. And I think on the file sub-bid, So my understanding is that the public law, it states that the contracts must be awarded to the lowest responsible and eligible bidder, and then they kind of go on to explain what responsible means. It's possessing skills, ability. I think they go to like integrity. So maybe this is oversimplifying it, but my recommendation would be to update the definition of responsible to include a history of BRJP compliance, right? Yeah. So we should be weighing a contractor's ability to provide residents, people of color, and women with employment as equal to their skill, ability, and integrity. That kind of legislation's outside of my skill set, but I think that if we can get some sort of language there for at least folks to consider that, it would at least be a step in the right direction.
Thank you for that. And then my last question is, for the jobs database, is it in multiple languages? You know me, my language questions, I got to put it out there. Would it be a public hearing unless I ask? Is it in multiple languages?
Currently, it's only in English.
Let me find out, Chris. Y'all gonna have to get those translators. Okay, I'm gonna let it go. I'm gonna send this right back to you, Flaherty. But I just think that we need to fight for language access. Language access is language justice. And I also really want to be super mindful, and I'll just get on my little soapbox real quick. It's not just about interpretation and translation. There are a lot of folks who can work, but don't know how to read and write even in their own native language. And we just have to be really super mindful of how we're building the workforce and being really intentional about making sure that everybody has access and information. So y'all better get in April when I ask this question again, Chris, you better act like you know and give me a yes, okay? You better go talk to Marty about that.
It's a great question. Obviously, that's something that's solvable. So I think that's a takeaway moving forward. So I know and our colleague Ricardo Arroyo is next. He's been very patient. Ricardo, just one point is Selena has to join a 2:00 call. She's running a little late. Do you have anything specific for her? You could address that right out of the gate. Other than that, we're going to release Selena to a prior commitment, and then we'll continue with your testimony.
Is Selena the only representative here for the administration right now?
No, negative. Well, we have Travis Watson and Christopher Brown are still on in their capacities as Boston Employment Commission and Boston Residency Job Policy.
Would either of them be able to answer a question, just in case I have to release you, in terms of going deeper into the numbers the administration presented? In that case, then.
Yeah, Selena.
So those are my only two questions. So. Yeah, so Selena, good luck at your next meeting. I'm good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before I jump off, I wanted to mention to Councilor Mejia's question about data. We do have currently on our website, which is boston.gov/BRJP, we do have compliance statistics. And what you'll see is a static PDF, which is what we're trying to move away from. But it goes all the way through the end of September. And what you can see is for every project, what their workforce numbers look like. It's not going to have that compliance information that we were talking about, like did they submit their paperwork on time? But you can definitely see a number of all the projects that are there, and that goes through the end of September. And then we've added a link to the Analyze Boston data set, which connects to the Access system, where you can see live data if you're looking for a particular project. So there is some information there I want to make sure you all are aware of, and I can definitely in a follow-up send direct links to you all.
Very good. Thank you, Selena. Thank you for your time and attention to today's hearing, and keep up the great work. Appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for your commitment to this work and your partnership. I really appreciate it.
Enjoy your afternoon. Councilor Arroyo, you have the floor.
Thank you. And most of my questions were already sort of asked, and some of my concerns were already aired, and so I won't retread that. I do want to thank Chair Watson for your advocacy in your presentation. And I have two questions I don't believe were dived into, so I'm going to ask these two things and then cede the rest of my time. The presentation by the administration basically broke down in 4 areas: neighborhood development, parks, public facilities, and public works, what the breakdown was for resident percentage, people of color percentage, and women percentage. And I know they may note that on every single one of those 4 things, the women percentage was off. But there were several where the percentage, for instance, parks has it off on all of them. It's at 22% for residents, 26% for people of color, 4% for women. And when you go to Public Works, they meet the requirement for residency, but not the one for people of color. And they're at 3% for women, 30% for people of color. And so I just want to know if there's anything specific. And those also are the two smallest brackets of work hours. So I acknowledge that. But also, is there an explanation for why that is true? Why Parks is not meeting those requirements on all three, and why in Public Works they're not meeting it in the category for people of color and women?
Yeah, well, typically with the Parks projects, they're really small projects. You might have a playground, a swing set, or that's being refurbished or replaced. So those contractors that are working on those projects are typically smaller contractors. And unfortunately, it's the smaller contractors that tend not to have women working for them. So you might have two owner, two brothers that own a company. They would be the ones working out there, and they wouldn't have a woman working for them.
But by that same token, wouldn't it be easier to locate a smaller firm of contractors that are people of color?
Right. So, you're asking whether there are smaller contractors that are minority contractors?
So, yeah, basically what I'm saying is I imagine it's easier to find smaller firms and contractors that are entirely owned by people of color or partly owned by people of color. And so I can understand that smaller firms may not be employing women, but it doesn't make sense to me at that stage then that 26% of them was all we could find for people of color. I feel like if you're talking about people of color doing small projects in contracting, it would allow you to hire more independent small contractors, especially if we're talking about 2-3 people jobs.
Right.
Is that assumption though off base? I don't know if either of you know if that's.
I think your assumption is accurate.
If I may just jump into, from my perspective, I've been asking similar questions. Some of the responses that I've received is that many of these public facilities projects do adhere to the file sub-bid process. So those firms, right off the bat, you get with what you kind of have to take with whatever you're given. The remaining contracts that are up and available, there absolutely can be better coordination between procurement departments and the compliance departments. And I think last, just as a small example, we did have a project, I'd say in this last calendar year with terrible numbers. So I went in expecting to be a bit heavy-handed. It was a skateboard park. I'm going back to my early days, but the half pipe, I believe it's called, on the skate park, the way that the concrete was poured, I believe that there's only 3 companies in the country that actually did this style of skate park. So in that case, we were stuck with the firm, and I think they were from California. So you can imagine, at least from my perspective, how frustrating it is. And I know it is for many folks online here when we're having folks from outside the state performing that kind of work. But those things have come up.
Okay, so, but I still see that, and I think there might have even been at Hyde Park because we have that skate park here. And so I see that there's opportunities there for, kind of these very niche projects that might have a very specialized or very small group of contractors available. But I still would be interested in understanding why those numbers are where they are for that. 26% is just not good. Especially if we're talking about smaller bids. And what I hear all the time is we don't have people of color available to take on these bigger projects, but, because they're all small shops, and hearing that these are smaller projects and we're not seeing that diversity, which doesn't include, obviously, the issue with women, but it is something that I noticed right off the bat with parks. And is that similar to what's happening in Public Works? Are those mostly small projects? Is that the issue there as well?
Yes, sidewalks, road work. You might have a contractor that's, putting the sidewalk. You have like 2 or 3 workers working, putting that sidewalk in.
Councilor Arroyo, and to your earlier point, I'll just answer that directly. These folks aren't being hired. So yes, there are MBEs WBs out there. There's women workers, there's people of color workers, particularly in Boston. These firms are not being hired because it's a choice of the developer not to hire them. Sometimes it's a conscious choice, like I'm uncomfortable with them because I don't know them. I've seen that come up. Sometimes it's like I don't know they exist, but there are also tough conversations, and you know I know that they're happening where they're just choosing not to hire these small firms, particularly the ones that represent women and people of color. It's a conscious choice.
And how much of that is union driven, union contract work as opposed to non-union contract work?
Chris, you have the breakdown?
Yeah, so the part in terms of on the breakdown?
Yes.
Well, I don't have the breakdown in front of me, but out the work hours, about 2/3 of the work hours are union work hours. So you have 2 million hours, about 1.5 million are union work hours, give or take.
And do we know how much in that union work hour, so how much of the non-union labor is women and people of color, and how much of the union labor is women and color? Do we have that breakdown? In other words, if 66% of those work hours happen to be union, are they bringing down the average of people of color and women on these jobs, or are they increasing them when we talk about them as a whole with the 100% of work hours?
So typically non-union companies perform better than the union companies on construction projects.
In terms of diversity?
In terms of diversity, yes.
How much better? Do we have like a percentage on that?
Yeah, well, I can give you, well, usually like on the city projects, it's gonna be in the range of like 50% people of color, and the Boston resident percentage is like in the mid-30s, and the female is maybe like 5 or 6% on the non-union side.
Okay. Chair Watson, did you have some there? I saw you muted several times.
Well, just in terms of, I think I made the point earlier, but I would say that 95, 96, 97% of the MBE firms are non-union. So you're inherently there going to have a sway to one side. And I think that, I pointed out earlier, just from the data that I've seen from doing an eye test, from looking at numerous union projects, I'm still pretty confident that the overall, like across all the union trades, we're only looking at like 2 to 3% black. So, I mean, I think that number's quite telling as well.
I would agree. And just one of the things that brings me to my second and last question. In the people of color percentage breakdown, are we tracking exactly who we're talking about when we say people of color? In other words, what is the Latino percentage of that? What is the African-American black percentage of that? Are we tracking what is making up that percentage? Because if we have a people of color hire rate, for instance, with the DND that says 68%, but then we get into what that 68% is, and it's mostly Latino and a vast majority Latino, and it's not African-American black, that's an imbalance for me. If it's the other way around, then that tells me we have to do more outreach there. And so are we digging deeper into those numbers, or is it just people of color? Do we have that information?
With the current database only tracks all people of color as 1%. It doesn't break down by different categories.
I would say that's a mistake. We should probably be breaking down by categories. In fact, I would suggest we do that, because it tells me whether or not we are hiring in par with what our population is, first and foremost, in terms of the percentages there, but also where the discrepancies and inequities are happening to a deeper degree, right? I can't tell whether or not, we have this issue with contracting where we talk about the number of contracts that we give out as a city to minority-owned businesses, and then it's some really poor percentage, and then within that, it's an even poorer percentage of Black-owned businesses, right? And so I really want to see the breakdown of whether or not we have, 68%, that's great, people of color, that's fantastic. But then we break that number down and it's some poor number for African-American Blacks, that's going to be a problem for me. And so, that just saying people of color as a plethora without breaking down who we're talking about doesn't allow me to know what communities are being let out of these opportunities and what communities are being brought in. And so that's a real problem for me, because these numbers are sort of deceptive in that way. When I look at 26% for parks, I don't know if that's 26% entirely made up of African-American Blacks and there's like maybe a small percentage of Latinos, or if it's a majority Latinos, or if we're looking at a 50-50 split. And so those kinds of numbers matter because they identify different problems. And so I would love to see that data broken down in a much better way than just, you know, people of color as a whole. Does it include Asians? Are we including Asians in the people of color number? Because we just had a Boston Latin examination discussion in which we had BPS say that it was a majority person of color school because 36.7% of their population was Asian. And so I don't know what these numbers represent in terms of what groups specifically are getting these jobs, and if we are hiding deep inequities by showing these numbers as a whole, if that makes sense to folks. And so I can't do much with this data without that information in terms of targeting and shaming and naming and doing the things that I need to do to get the numbers I need to get for specific communities, right? And so that's just one thing I would say. We don't do the census just people of color. And so we have to have a way to do this.
I agree 100%. And at the risk of being reckless without actual data in front of me, being in the weeds as much as I am, if we're talking, just to answer your question directly, if we're talking a union project and we're talking about people of color participation, I am very confident that that number is 70% Latino and much higher. I'm talking very, very low percentage of who would identify as Black Americans. Very, extremely low.
And that's my concern. And so that's what I want to see what these numbers really are, because when we're talking about, you know, the averages in the city and what they should look like, you know, obviously the number of people of color on these jobs should be higher than this. So it's not a matter of just allotting 40% and saying 20% for you, 20% for you. But it's a matter of saying if we're only achieving 10% or 15% of that 68% number is African-American Black, then we are failing on a lot of fronts there. And there's a lot of issues, both obvious and maybe not so obvious, that need to be addressed. And so if we can get that numbers, I know we do this, is it every 6 months?
That's correct, yes.
If we can have those numbers for the next 6 months, is that a possible thing? Is that something the city can track?
I can look into it.
Not to interject, but my understanding is that the unions don't provide that information. So we're going to run into the roadblock that I was addressing earlier.
Is there a legal reason for that?
I have just been told, I've asked many times, I've just been told that we do not collect that information. Hard stop.
Can they be mandated to do that? Is basically my question. Is that something that legally we can mandate if we wrote an ordinance or did some of that nature to get that data collection? Is there a legal reason why they would just say people of color? If you can tell me you got people of color, it wouldn't seem the reason you can't tell me who exactly they are in terms of percentages. So is there a way to handle that, if anybody knows?
Considering I'm not a paid employee, anything's outside of my pay grade at this point, but that question is literally outside my pay grade.
All right, well, that's what I'll be looking into. So appreciate everybody on this call. And I'll be figuring out why, because when people don't want to share data, that's telling in and of itself. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. And Kerry, if you're on, is there anyone in the waiting room looking to offer public testimony? And if that's the case, if you can allow them onto the floor. So I do know that we had Ms. Priscilla Banks had requested, and I think Mr. Norman Stemridge had either offered to testify or was sending in written testimony, which I believe that we've got a copy of for colleagues. But if there's anybody from the public who is still with us, and obviously appreciate their patience. We're about 2.5 hours in. Looks like I see Kim Odom is joining us as we speak. So, and if Kim, if you can hear, please unmute yourself. You have the floor. Just introduce yourself for the record, any affiliation, and you can offer testimony.
So just for clarification, Councilor Flaherty, Kim Odom is the BEC coordinator, and I believe she was in the attendees and may have just moved over to panelists. I don't believe that she's offering testimony.
No, I'm not offering testimony, but I am Kim Odom.
How are you, Kim? Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Very good. Thanks for staying on and joining us. So I guess Kerry has uploaded everyone that's been patiently waiting, and I do not see our good friend Priscilla Flint Banks on the screen, and I do not see Mr. Norman Stembridge. So we will make sure that we get his public testimony. But so seeing and hearing no desire for public testimony, I'm going to put that on hold, and then we're going to shift over to the lead sponsor, Council President Janey, for, I guess, any additional questions or parting comments for our panelists. And I appreciate Travis Watson and Christopher Brown staying with us throughout the hearing's entirety on behalf of their respective groups, Boston Employment Commission and the Boston Residency Job Policy. So with that, Madam President, you have the floor to give some additional questions or comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will be brief. I want to echo your thanks to Chris and to Travis for staying on the entire time. I did have some follow-up questions that I wanted to ask regarding the slide that breaks down the D&D, the parks, the public facilities, and public works. But given the questions and comments of my colleague, Councilor Arroyo, I won't go too much into the weeds there, only to echo what I say every time we have these conversations, which is that it is very, very, very important for the city of Boston to make sure it's doing its part in meeting these goals. And if the city isn't doing it, it is very hard to hold private folks accountable. So I don't want to go too far in here, only that, you know, my first time at a BEC meeting, and when I caught wind of what was at that time the Dudley Library, and Travis, you were giving, there were two actual developers in my district who were just way off base, and we, you know, caught this at the tail end of the projects, but you were certainly giving them the business, which I appreciate. And since that time, we began monitoring what is now the Roxbury Public Library, and the numbers did improve. I don't know that they've hit, you know, we always do the overall, but you're not getting kind of the trade by trade. And that building is now open for takeout anyway. So that is great and wonderful that we've kind of come to the end of that. But I want to emphasize the importance here. I think in closing, there were some important nuggets that we heard from the panel. So again, I want to thank the entire panel, not just Chris and Travis, but Chief Barrows and certainly Selena, who was here. And I think she came back, but maybe she's gone again. But also from my colleagues. And I'm sorry that we couldn't hear from Priscilla and Norm. I know they are both huge advocates in this space and have done a lot of work in this space. And they may also have some good solutions for us moving forward. But I think in terms of SALESFORCE, we heard some good nuggets. I think we do. I agree with Councilor Arroyo. I think a breakdown of what we mean by people of color, and if we're still at the building phase of this collection of data, I think we have an opportunity to kind of go deeper in what we collect there. I think there are more opportunities, certainly around language access that we heard from Councilor Mejia, and connecting the dots in terms of the jobs bank and making sure that folks are getting connected, not just to opportunities to build their own skills, but to actual jobs. I think we may need to look at, you know, amending the current ordinance or filing new legislation around a number of things that we heard today. And I look forward to working with my colleagues, with all of the advocates, certainly the administration, and the BEC. I want to mention the BEC specifically, just so I'm not sure if you consider yourself part of the administration, but all the folks who have been working so hard on this space, certainly the Boston Jobs Coalition, the various carpenters, people mentioned the Carpenters Union specifically. They have, I think, a model program where young people can go spend 4 years with them and get paid to do it, and then have a good job. And they are diverse. And they also, not only the painters, I think, are in Madison, I think the carpenters are at Madison as well. So I think there are real opportunities, but we have to be laser-like focused around racial equity, around Boston residents, around women, around connecting the dots, around our own political will to challenge and be willing to face the lawsuit. I've said it from year one, if this is the thing folks want to sue on, let's have it. Let's go. And I think now more than ever, let's go. So I am looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you and hoping that we will have much better results in terms of closing some of these loose ends or tightening up these loose ends around Salesforce, around some language for sanctions, or going deeper into the numbers around race and ethnicity. So I want to just end by saying thank you, and certainly thank you to folks behind the scenes, central staff, for all your work. And thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you, Madam President, obviously for the role in co-sponsoring with our colleague, Councilor Lydia Edwards. And thank you to all of my colleagues who participated. Thank you to the panelists and also the unsung heroes, Fernando Ortiz and Caitlin Passafaro as sort of government affairs liaisons behind the scenes, pulling everything together as well, working with our council staff, Kerry and Christine O'Donnell. So with that said, prepared to adjourn the hearing at this point with respect to Docket 0427, order for a hearing regarding biannual review of the Boston Employment Commission and Boston Residency Job Policy. The Committee on Government Operations is adjourned. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon and try to catch some of this great weather while it lasts.
You too.
Have a great day. God bless everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for your work.